week. So now we're going to look at database servers. You're going to turn your Raspberry Pi or your virtual machine into a fully fledged multi-user database server. So we're going to look at installation, which is actually painfully simple because you've got Debian on your system. We're going to look at users and databases, and that's a little trickier because you, depending on how you're trying to access the database, you have to change permissions. So it's not quite as easy as it seems. That's it. That's how you install the MySQL server. Technically, all you need is that one. It takes up 90 meg of your SD card, and that installs a full MySQL server. If you want to run the MySQL command from a secure shell, to connect to your database, you need to install the client. So you can install the database, but you won't be able to type in MySQL -u, all that sort of stuff, because that MySQL command is actually part of the MySQL client. It's 125K, yeah? If you can spare that amount of storage space on your SD card, I'd stick it on, because it's going to make your life a lot easier. And you install that. It does take some time, especially on a 700 megahertz ARM processor. It's not the quickest thing. So make a cup of tea and a sandwich when it's installing. It takes about 8 minutes to install. And halfway through, the only thing it asks you for, prompts you for, is the root password. Again, just like the root Linux account, the root password gives permissions on everything. So it asks you to set the password for your root user as part of the installation. Its default is it leaves it blank. Not recommended. I'd choose something quite complex for that. Now, once you've installed it, there's only one configuration file, and you find this a lot. The etc. folder contains all your config files. That's the sort of tip of the day. Every time you install a new package, it creates a folder inside the etc. folder. And inside that folder, you will find the config file. So when we install the FTP server, you'll find VSFTPD folder in there, which is the name of the script, the package, and in there you'll find the config file. When you install Apache, you'll find etc/Apache folder in there. And inside there'll be a config file for Apache. So whenever you install a package, you always know where to find the config file. It's always in the same place. And every time the MySQL server loads, starts running, it reads that config file to determine what settings it should run as. That means if you need to make changes here, you've got to restart the database. Okay? Just like if you change network settings, you have to restart the network. If you were to change the Apache settings, which we'll talk about next week, you have to restart the Apache server. Now again, there's a special folder called init.d in the etc. folder, and you don't realise how important this folder is. This folder, anything in this folder gets run when the machine boots. So if you want to run a script when the machine when you power the machine on, you simply put your script in that init.d folder. So anything in there gets run at boot time. Obviously, it's set permissions properly as well. So, for example, I've been working on some sort of Bluetooth beacons, and I need to set a message and switch the broadcast on. Well, if I didn't put my script in the init.d folder, I'd have to log on when the machine booted up. I'd have to run some commands separately or run a script to get things working. I simply created the script, tested it, then moved it into the init.d folder. And now every time I power the Raspberry Pi on, it powers up and switches the beacon on at the same time. So again, those two folders, the etc. folder and especially the init.d subfolder, are really, really useful and important. So here's the MySQL settings. And as you can see, the user is MySQL. Remember I said every single package has to have a user to run under. The PID we'll talk about another time. Basically, every process that runs on the server has an identifier, an integer value. So if you want to kill a process, you find its PID value and you kill that PID value. That's it. So basically every thread has that. If you type in the command top, it lists all the threads that are running with their PID values. And then you can use the kill command, type in the PID value, and it'll kill that process for you. So it's as long as you root, obviously. Now, data directory, look, there we are. If you want to find the actual MySQL data files, they're in that folder, var lib MySQL. But again, you could specify a folder on a different server if you wanted to, or a different folder on this server. The most important bit is that bit there. Now, who's tried to connect to the created MySQL server using something like MySQL Workbench? Yeah, did it work? Okay. That's because of that bind address. 127001 is code for localhost. So what it's saying is the address of the server is the localhost, the actual on the server itself, which means it can't be seen outside the server. It's brilliant for security. Yeah, it basically means no one can connect to your database server without logging into your shell. And if you take out the MySQL client, no one can log onto your server and use MySQL client to access your database. So you can then restrict it to the PHP scripts. So only they can modify the database. So that 127001 is the key to protecting your database from outside use. If you want to access it from outside, the bind address has to be your IP address. That makes sense, doesn't it? So when someone connects to your database, they use the IP of the server. And that's why, if you want to access your server from elsewhere, you have to change the bind address to your IP address. If you do that, you can access the server using things like MySQL Workbench, which makes your life a lot easier, doesn't it? You've got the Uml diagrams, haven't you? You've got your commands, you can build your tables and so on. There is a security risk for this. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do you feel lucky? Do you need access? There's nothing stopping you from giving access while you're building your server, and then once the server's built and configured, removing that access. That's what I would do if I was building the web server and I had lots of stuff to do. I'd simply give myself access, use MySQL Workbench, and when I've finished, go into the config file and just set that back to localhost. And that way you've protected yourself. Now, that's the easy bit. You've got your database, you can log in as root, and you can obviously then create tables and so on. And you can access your files, your database files, from outside. The important bit is data security and the users, the database users. Now, if you want to create databases, okay, not tables, databases, you have to use the create database command in MySQL, hence the semicolon. So that's what we use. We actually, as part of our script to create your accounts, we run this command in the same shell script we use to create your secure shell account. So it's all automated for us now. We just type in one command and it does everything at the same time. Create database and the name of the database you want. You can have hundreds of databases on the same server. And think about creative. Every single one of you has got your own database on the server, haven't you? Yeah, you can't see each other's databases. You've each got permissions for your database. That's down to the setup of the server and how we configured it. Okay, we also can create users for the database. Username, password, plain text. Okay, so again, this could be part of your script to build new users. And this user can access the server from anywhere. Okay, this test user has permissions to access it from off the server. Now, we also can change the password. If we want the access to be just from localhost, like you've got, we append that when we create the user. If we say at localhost when we create the user account, it can only be used from localhost. In other words, you have to log in through secure shell. You have to use MySQL, the MySQL command. That's how we restrict access initially. So here's how we set the password, and if we say test user at localhost, that's effectively restricting the user to the local host, the local computer. Now, privileges. Privileges. There are dozens of database privileges. Every database command you use, like select, insert, create, delete, grant, update, sorry, update, that one already, what else have we got? Revoke, create, all these commands are tied to the privileges. So if you want someone to run an SQL command, you have to make sure they've been given privileges. If you've got a database, if you've got a website which is just reading data off the database, you can create a special account for it where it just has select and nothing else. So this is a classic one for a database, for a web server. You create an account to use in your PHP scripts, and all you really need is select, insert, delete, update, don't you? Because once you've built the tables and the structures, the PHP script is going to be grabbing data out of it to display, inserting new records, deleting the record, updating. Sometimes you wouldn't even give delete. You work out exactly what SQL commands you're using on your web scripts and assign the right privileges to the database. The more restrictive you make it, the more secure it is. And of course, the classic thing for the web account is, because the web server is probably on the same server that you're on, that the database is on, make it localhost. Think how restricted that is. So they have to be on the server, and they can only execute those SQL statements. So you can really nail things down. That's what we've given you. I would create two database accounts. One as a developer account for you building the tables and structuring it and populating it and doing everything else. And a second account to use with the PHP scripts, to use with your database, with your web server scripts. This is what I've given you. So you've got grant, create, alter, select, insert, delete, update, create, view, drop, so you can delete your tables, index, lock. Yeah, and that's exactly what I've just lifted out of the script that we use to build your accounts. So that's if you want the same permissions that you've got on Creative, that's what you need to give yourself. Okay. Now it gets better. You can control access to individual tables by different users. The chances are, for example, your web script doesn't need access to every single table in your database. So what you do, when we grant it, let's go back a slide a minute. You see that? Bookshop.star. That means the bookshop database with every table inside it. The asterisk means every table. If you just wanted to give access to the genres table, you could say bookshop.genres. And that will give those permissions to that user on that table. And that's what you call granular permissions. You can precisely assign the right permissions. And that's why the database admin job in most organizations is such a highly paid, responsible job. Because you're responsible for assigning the correct permissions to the users for the database. And if you get it wrong, it could be rather catastrophic. We can even control access to individual columns on individual databases. This is what we really call granular. So let's imagine you want them to be able to update, to read all the data, but only update certain columns, or only insert, or only read certain columns. You can do that. If you give read permissions, give select permissions on certain columns, when they try and select star, they'll only see the columns that you've given them permissions on. So you could have a big database table, and different people see different sets of data depending on the permissions. And this is what makes a multi-user database so powerful. So here we are, look, select, update, the grant is the command, the grant select to those columns, update to those columns on bookshops.books to test user at localhost. And that's as granular as it gets, isn't it? We're saying they can read those three columns, but they can't update the ISBN. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because the ISBN is tied to that particular book. On bookshop.books, only on that book, on the books table, and only from the local device, from the local server. So that's getting good now. That's the control is starting to be established. Okay. Now, it gets even better than this. I've said you can access from off the server or on the server. That's simplifying things a bit too much. You can specify which machines you can connect from. So if you want, say, to use MySQL Workbench, you can restrict access to that external connection to, say, machines on the internal network or a machine with a particular IP address. So if you want only you to be able to access that database, you can say only my IP address on my laptop can be used to access that database. So here we are, from the database server. That's localhost, isn't it? If you want to access on the local network, well, the classic local network is 192.168.1 something, isn't it? That's the classic IP address pattern. The percentage sign means any value. So I'm saying here, grant select on bookshop.star, so all the bookshop tables, to web user coming from an IP address starting with 192.168.1. And that's often how you find databases secured. So even if you get the password off someone to access the database, unless you're on their computer, you can't access the database. Or on their internal network, you can't access the database. So this is where it gets really good. Okay? If you want to remove privileges, you can do that as well. The revoke command allows you to remove privileges. Revoke all means take all the privileges away. Revoke delete would mean take the delete privilege away. So you can tweak and customize the permissions you're giving the users. And obviously, it's good to see the privileges, isn't it? To see what privileges people have got. So you can show grants for and then put the username in, and it will list exactly what privileges that user has on which databases, which permissions, from which hosts. It'll give you everything you need to know. And the final thing you need to say is when you assign privileges, the database caches a version of those for easy access. If you change privileges and it doesn't work, run that command. What that does, it flushes out the cache, privilege cache, and reloads it from the source. So what we always do is when we create a new user for Creative, the last command we run is that. It just clears things through and reloads all the privileges. And obviously, just like you did with Creative, you can test your connections using the MySQL client, can't you? Now you know that's the MySQL client. Okay? And you can also test your server now by assigning the right permissions and testing it from externally using, say, MySQL Workbench. So you've got different ways of testing things out, and this is part of the assignment. MySQL Workbench, have you used that before? Okay, I'll give you a quick guided tour, we've got time. MySQL Workbench is by Oracle, so it's by the MySQL developers, and it looks like this. And the first thing you have to do is create a new connection to your database. And you simply put your IP address in, username, the database you want to connect to, which is the schema, and you can test to make sure the connection is valid. And that means you can now actually connect your database from this graphical tool. And there it is, look. I've called that on Raspberry Pi, there's my IP address, there's my database I'm connected to, there's my username I'm connecting from, and I can store that permanently in MySQL. There's some really cool tools, like for example, see this model thing here? If you click on the little arrow there, you can actually build a visual UML diagram from your online database. So it asks you which database you want to connect to, it asks you what tables you want to include, and it will then produce a nice UML diagram showing the primary keys, foreign keys, field names, and so on. And that's quite useful. So you can make changes to it, then you can push the changes back to your database. Saves you having to do lots of SQL commands. Okay, database admin. The database, every database is a folder in that folder. That's it. And every table is a file inside that folder. So each database is a folder, and each table is a file. You can't look at them, they're binary data, but if you want to back up your database very quickly, rather than running scripts to do it, you can simply just drag the file folder onto a backup server. or script it. So really easy to back up the database. If you want to list all the users, there's a user table, and you simply select user and host. There's the users, and there's the host. And you can see the test user has permission from anywhere, web user from the local network, and root has access from localhost. So it gives you a very quick way of checking your permissions. Process list. Right, can you remember we had problems with the first assignment in 305 where you couldn't connect to the database? Remember that one? And I had all these emails saying you couldn't connect and it wasn't accepting connections. This is what was causing the problem. Right, all I did when I had the problem, I typed in show process list and I got a huge list. It was screens and screens and screens. And it shows the username, where they're connecting from, the database they're connecting to, and what the current status is. So for example, localhost is in the process of carrying out a query. These are asleep. This is how long the connection's been connected for. When the server was set up, that connection time was too big. It was hanging on to connections for too long. So you would run a command through your PHP script, and then it would maintain that connection to the database. I think it's something like an hour or two, which was ridiculous. So all I did is in the config file for the database, I made it 1,000 seconds. So if you didn't repeat a command within 1,000 seconds, it closed the connection, and then when you connected again, it created a new connection. And I went from having 130 concurrent users to having 5. Because the maximum connected users in the config file was 130. So it got to that limit, and then wouldn't allow you to connect anymore. So there you are, more useful information. Timeout, my.conf. Default timeout, and they're the two key settings if you depend on how many users you've got connecting. If you've got a couple of users who are doing high intensity work, you would set your timeout to high and your users to low. If you've got lots of users doing small things, you would set your timeout to quite a low value and set your connections to a high value. So you can tweak those values to suit your environment. There you are. So the timeout is 80,000 seconds. That was what the problem was. And max connections in this example is 100. But if you do make these changes, don't forget to restart the server. Otherwise, it won't take effect. That's it, guys. Okay? So a good solid 50 minutes. The presentations for 320 and 305 are already on Moodle, ready to go. And I will see you in lab tomorrow. Don't forget your USB cable and your SD card at the very least. Okay, and if you've got a Raspberry Pi, bring it along.